Yeah, and welcome to the show, Prop Anon, aka Gabriel Kennedy. I know you from, you used to be in a band called Eris, didn't you, a long time ago?
Yeah, I guess it is a long time ago now. Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't that bad, man. It's great.
But for the audience that don't know you, could you give them a brief biography of yourself, please?
Sure, no problem. Well, firstly, Ken, thank you for having me here today, man. It's great to finally connect. Yeah, I grew. My name is Gabriel Kennedy. I grew up just outside of New York City, roughly 23 miles from Brooklyn. My parents both came from Ireland, and I was in Ireland and the UK a number of times in my youth. So it's nice to always kind of stay connected to both sides of the pond, if you will. I became involved. I describe myself as a multimedia artist, concentrating on the written word, music, and film. This is my first book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson. Before this, I wrote for a number of online outlets like realitysandwich.com, boingboing.net, mondo2000.com, my own websites. I've was involved with music for a number of years. I mean, I'm still a musician, but writing the book, I kind of put the pen down for a little bit in terms of the music. But I had a band called Eris, which is like a stoner rock doom metal band. We released an album. And that was really good in 2014. And then before then, I've always been doing this sort of like street art and sort of hip hop, emceeing and DJing, filmmaking and stuff as Prop Anon or Propaganda Anonymous, and did that for a number of years, ever since I was young, really, and kind of transitioned more into just kind of writing books, although I've always wanted to write books. Ever since I discovered, I guess, Henry Miller way back in the day. So fast forward, I discovered Robert Anton Wilson my senior year of high school. I read Illuminatus Trilogy when I was 17 or 18, and I just became hooked. I went on to read everything I could get my hands on of him, and read his books, again and again. And he became my favorite writer. And in like a milieu of countercultural writers, he stood out still as my favorite. And I became involved in this thing called the Maybe Logic Academy that Wilson started in 2004. And he ran it with his co-producer, if you will, Lance Bauscher, for those 3 years. And right before the interview, I met and I interviewed Wilson myself on July 24th, 2003, the day after the premiere of a documentary about him that Lance Bauscher made. And that was called Maybe Logic, The Lives and Ideas of Robert Anton Wilson. So, when I was 15, I discovered psychedelics, and I became very passionate or enthusiastic about, the metaphor of, a shamanic metaphor of approaching your life. So, I was involved in like the rave scene at that time. And this idea of like shamanism was really big in the cultural zeitgeist. And I got super into the Doors and Jim Morrison, and I got into the notion of Celtic shamanism. And I kind of viewed my life within like a sort of shamanic perspective, not meaning like I was going to be a shaman, but in terms of, I guess, that easily bleeds over to magic, like life, viewing life through a magical lens. So, when I got the chance to meet and interview Wilson, this was like meeting the sensei. This was like meeting the master at the top of the mountain. And he did not disappoint, when I interviewed him on July 24th, 2003. And so I just stayed writing and working. And eventually, many years later, I created this book, Chapel Perilous, The Lives and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson.
That's cool. July 24th is my birthday as well. There's synchronicity there as well. Yeah. Wilson. I mean, I was introduced to him. I'm trying to think when I was a huge Philip K. Dick fan, massive Philip K. Dick fan, and sort of known for loving Philip K. Dick. And all these people used to tell, "Oh, you've got to read Robert Anton Wilson if you like Philip K. Dick." They're kind of crossover there. And I was always like, yeah, whatever, you get sort of like territorial about your authors, kind of thing, I find anyway. But yeah, no, I think eventually I borrowed the Illuminatus trilogy, and then that I was like, well, actually, this is really good, and yeah, then went off on a Robert Anton Wilson tangent, and obviously, I mean, the show's named after one of his books, and yeah, huge influence. And it was interesting, some of the magazines you said you used to write for, a lot of those people who are involved with those magazines are involved in the show as well. So we've had like Are You Serious on from Monday 2000 years ago, and David Metcalf, who I do the Mo Zone with, I think he's written for Reality Sandwich a few times.
I remember seeing his name.
I think it was him. I think that was one of the ones he used to write. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, no, it's he's definitely a writer whose tentacles reach out into many, especially countercultural kind of arenas and sort of esoteric arenas. That's for sure. But so yeah, when this is one I always, when people ask you to describe Robert Anton Wilson's work, what do you tell them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I've recently been saying that, he's, and this is because someone told me this, and I thought that's a great way to describe it. His work, a cornerstone of the 1960s counterculture. That's a pretty, succinct way of summing up his voice. Because when you think about it, I mean, he really expressed nearly everything that was, you'd say, positive that came from that generational mind. It came through Wilson's work. He, related, the notion of the sexual revolution, the marijuana legalization, gay rights, the social revolution, economic, sort of a revolution, if you will, and technological, knowledge, right? Like him being such an anticipatory sort of thinker, right? He's a cornerstone thinker of the 1960s counterculture who was, sort of an early radar warning system for what was coming around the bend. And I'd say that, people who kind of know Wilson from a certain distance, they will associate him immediately with just sort of conspiracy theories and the Illuminati conspiracy theory. And that's probably because they've only read Illuminatus trilogy, which that's fine, right? But as you dig deeper in Wilson's work, you see that he's not a one-trick pony. He's an artist who is exploring some very deep existential questions within his work, as all great artists should, right? So that's why I kept returning to his work, really, is, it wasn't just because this guy talked about conspiracy theories and the Illuminati. It's the way that he wrote. So I describe him as a damn fine writer. A very funny individual, and then someone really whose voice is vital to discover if you haven't, or rediscover right now, because I mean, everything that the world has been going through in the last number of years is in my book, because these are all sort of tired reruns of tropes of like the 20th century and further back now. I mean, it's the 19th century, all these things that have gotten kicked up in the public mind, the global public mind. It's such an interesting time, and I think Wilson wrestled with all of these things, and it's in all of his work, so he's sort of like, he's a counterpiece to George Carlin, really, right? I mean, George Carlin did it with stand-up, but Carlin considered himself a writer, and he definitely was a writer. He was a philosopher, really. I mean, they call Carlin's comedy now social criticism comedy, or social commentary comedy, which isn't all comedy social commentary. But I mean, and Bob is essentially the same, and it makes sense then that they were friends, and it makes sense that George Carlin was, one of Wilson's earliest fans. So I like telling people that, because most people know George Carlin, and only a select few know Robert Anton Wilson.
So what made you go from Wilson fan to Wilson kind of biographer, I suppose?
Another great question, Ken. I think that I knew that I wanted to be a writer before discovering Bob's work. I mean, it was, it just like, it was more a desire than like, I was sitting down at the age of 15 and writing novels and whatnot. It was just this sort of loose desire to kind of live like a freed up lifestyle, right? And coming across certain writers, like I said, like Henry Miller, maybe before reading Robert Anton Wilson, I think he kind of like infused the desire and the passion more, like to write, to be an artist. And discovering Wilson, Henry Miller was long dead, and Robert Anton Wilson was still alive. Discovering his work, so he, quickly kind of became my favorite living writer. And I think perhaps some of it is in the like sort of that transition between being a fan and a biographer of Wilson is almost laid within Wilson's approach to his work and philosophy, is that, he did not want to be a guru. He did not want to be, he was an egalitarian, like in everyday life, meaning like he was not trying to, lord over anyone or whatnot. So and that came through in his writing. So his research was clear, but he always gave credit to where he got his ideas from. And somehow that kind of inspired something in me too, to like just write and just attribute. Let your thoughts go, but attribute where you get these thoughts. And so Wilson is, I mean, I know I'm not the only one who gets this from his work. Like he was part of the process, reading engaging with his art was inspiration to create my own, and I think that's a vital part of his message, is that, I mean, we're all artists, like he liked to quote Nietzsche, who used to say, we're all greater artists than we realize. But he would apply that to our perception, meaning we're always co-creating our reality. We're shaping reality into our own reality tunnel, all the time. We're shaping all the signals and the stimuli, right? So you could mold yourself, if you will. But I had a desire anyway, since I was like 15. I don't know where it came from. I mean, there's no one in my family that are writers or anything like that, but.
Yeah, I was wondering how do you go about kind of gathering, because it's quite how do you go about kind of gathering records and information? Because there's an archive, is there? There was kind of a bit of one at the Leary, one of Leary's archives, I think, had a small Wilson archive in it, didn't it? A long time ago. I don't know if that still exists.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's not that I know of anywhere. There's no real archive, is there? How did you go about kind of gathering, all the documents or pieces of information you needed for the book?
Yeah, you're right. I guess the only sort of official archive in a way that has a little like a folder even dedicated to Robert Anton Wilson at the moment is the Timothy Leary papers that's held at the New York Public Library in New York City in Manhattan. And Wilson has a few folders there, and that's because of Leary's archivist, Michael Horowitz, who is Winona Ryder's father, was Leary's lifelong archivist. And for a number of years, because he was also friends with Bob, he was Wilson's archivist. But that's only for a small block of time, and it's not for too many materials. So that was a very interesting part of, writing this book was, going out on the adventure and the journey of piecing together all these different Wilson, sort of amassing my own Wilson archives and special collections just in my own private office. So meaning that because there is no centralized, special collections for Wilson's work yet, of any sort of, detail or heft, I had to go out and access other writers and thinkers' special collections to find correspondence that Wilson had written to these people. So, for instance, I found the Norman Mailer archives at the University of Texas, of which they had a number of letters, maybe about 8 letters written from Wilson, a correspondence between Wilson and Mailer in the early 60s. Like 1962 is the first letter that Bob wrote to Norman Mailer. And that was a great discovery because this is Wilson at the very beginning of his career, interacting with, perhaps the most successful American writer at the time, right? And onward it went. It was awesome. Like, because once I kind of understood how it worked, right, by gaining access to the New York Public Library special collections, I kind of went on like a tear. I went down the list of who else what other collections could I access? So William S. Burroughs special collections, which was also held at the New York Public Library. And now, some writers will have different special collections of their works. So some libraries, different colleges will hold different sections of some writers' works if they're big enough. Like I think Allen Ginsberg has like the Ginsberg papers in one school library and then another one in another library, right? However, Norman Mailer, I think, was all collected in one library, I think, right? And but yeah, so I went searching for the Allen Ginsberg papers as well, the Ed Sanders, Tully Kupferberg, and those two guys were beatnik poets who formed the proto-punk band, the Fugs, and they have that classic song, CIA Man, and also Tully's song, Go Fuck Yourself with the Atomic Bomb, which is very fitting these days. And I have a quick question, Ken. Like, so this is running on YouTube, yeah? Should I have to kind of use some of the censoring words or whatever? Because I know YouTube sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I think the only one we've got pulled up on in the past is unaliving. We have to say unaliving instead of the S word.
Okay.
That's the only one. Okay. Yeah, I think we can swear and whatever. I think it's only in the first 30 seconds or something that it pulls you up. But it's interesting about this. Wasn't there Chicago police like archive on like they were watching Anderson for a while? I remember him talking about that at one point.
Yeah, that was the Chicago Red Squad files on Bob and his wife Arlen, and that was a huge discovery because what it was. The Chicago Red Squad was a section of the Chicago Police Department that pretty much was like they worked with the FBI, like hand in glove, to surveil, subversives, political rights activists, peace activists, feminists who were against the Vietnam War. There was an organization that Arlen was a part of. I think it was just Women Against War, I think, and they were heavily surveilled. Feminists were had a huge target on them. It was Arlen had a bigger file than Bob, like because she was a feminist, I think. But the Chicago Red Squad had pretty much, surveilled Wilson's, Arlen and Bob a little bit, and a newspaper that they were a part of called the Roger Spark, which was a community-based newspaper that Bob and Arlen joined, based out of Evanston, Rogers Park, Chicago, which might be in Evanston, but that newspaper was amazing. I accessed nearly all of the issues of Roger Spark, and I have them still. That's such a great newspaper, what they covered, local news and national and world news. And so that was under surveillance by the Chicago Red Squad. The Chicago Red Squad also surveilled people like Fred Hampton, who was the very young Black Panther leader, super talented and young man who was killed at the age of 21 in 1969. And, it since has come out that the FBI and the Chicago police were, involved in that. I wouldn't say that. Well, that was an unaliving, but, Wilson, Bob and Arlen, they were very politically active in the late 60s in Chicago in terms of like traditional left political activity. They were involved in a lot of anarchist activity. And, Wilson at the time was working at Playboy magazine. And this is how I first learned about the Red Squad files, was never in anything Bob wrote. Wilson has never mentioned this story in any of his even articles that I found. He opened a talk that he was giving that I attended on December 4th, 2001, which I could be mistaken and I could be wrong, but that could be December 4th could be the day that Fred Hampton was murdered. But I saw Bob on December 4th, 2001 in San Francisco. And he started the speech before going in, because he would always start his talks with jokes. And he just said very nonchalantly, he's like, "You guys want to know how I became a paranoid?" And everyone's like, "Yeah, man." And I just eaten a weed cookie, a marijuana cookie. And I was just starting to come up, and here's Bob talking about being paranoid. And I was like, oh shit. And then, so he tells the story about how he was in Playboy working one day, and at Playboy magazine, all the doors were open to the offices because it was the 70s. And this mysterious executive comes into his office one day, and it's an executive that he's mysterious because he doesn't have an office in the executive floor. He has an office amongst all the writers and the creatives. Yet Wilson never saw this guy attending any sort of business meetings. He only saw this guy chaperoning, visiting celebrities when they came to town. And he would be the fella that took, Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra to, get some highballs at the Playboy Club or something like that, And so one day, and he never spoke to Bob, but one day he knocks on Wilson's office door and he says, "Hey, Bob, you got a minute?" Bob says, "Sure, of course." And he closes the door behind him. And that's when Bob knew that something was up, because again, in the 70s in Playboy, they always kept the doors open, right? He made a point to say that. And he said, "Listen, you're on the Red Squad files. You're being surveilled." And Bob's like, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, they think you're running guns for the Black Panthers." And Bob says, "What?" And the executive says, "Well, are you doing that? Because I have," and at the time what Bob was doing, so he said him and Arlen were helping the Black Panthers out with their free lunch program, or the free breakfast program, which is one of the huge contributions that the Black Panther Party has made to our culture. Wilson was extremely surprised, and he said, "Well, how do you know this?" And the guy said, "Well, I have a mole or a spy or whatnot, who is a CI, a confidential informant. So this guy gives information to the police, but then he'll kick back information to me. And he said that he heard about you, that you were running guns for the Black Panther Party. And are you doing that?" And Bob said, "No way, I'm not doing that." And he's like, "Well, that's all I needed to hear." He's like, "Well, I'll make sure that your name doesn't come up in anything, but keep your nose clean, buddy. Right? Have a good day." And Bob was like, "Wow, that was weird." And Wilson never found out about, he never accessed his own Red Squad files, right? When he moved on from Chicago, he just kept it moving. So this is the first time in my book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, that his Red Squad files are being discussed, and Arlen's as well. And like a caveat to that quick story is when I looked at the Red Squad files for Bob and Arlen, Arlen has, kind of consistent tabs being taken on her, or it's reflected in the files. So 1966, there's something on Arlen, 67, 68, until they leave Chicago in 1971. They briefly return in 1972 to attend a May Day rally at Haymarket Square, where there was a huge, the Haymarket affair that occurred in American history. It's a big anarchist sort of thing. And as I said, Arlen had a file consistently throughout that time. But Bob, there was one mention of him in 1966, nothing for the remainder of the time in Chicago, and then a mention of him in 1972 at that May Day rally. So this is after Bob had quit Playboy magazine and come back, and all of a sudden he pops up in the files again, which sort of leads me to believe perhaps that what he says in that story has the veracity, that perhaps that mysterious executive did keep his name out of the Red Squad files at that time, which, leads a suggestion to there's a whole, and this left an impact on Bob. He said at one point, that's where he got the idea. And I think he said this he did in 2001. He said, that's where he got the idea for Tobias Knight, a character in Illuminatus trilogy. Mm-hmm. Tobias Knight is not a double agent, not a triple agent, not even a quadruple agent. He's a quintuple agent. So he's playing 5 different sides in the story. And what was that? It was that experience, plus when he contemplated how many little FBI and police agents there were, agent provocateurs roaming around the counterculture in the 60s. And Tobias Knight was the epitome of that. Yeah.
Yeah, Tobias Knight and Illuminatus always kind of, because I can't remember if I'd read Illuminatus before or after The Invisibles, but they always felt like The Invisibles was kind of tangentially linked to Illuminatus in some weird way. I don't know why. And it's interesting she had Grant write an intro for your book as well, that's kind of cool. How did that happen?
Yeah, that was really cool. Wow. Yeah. So I first learned about Grant Morrison and Douglas Rushkoff and Richard Metzger at the 2000 Disinfo conference that was held in New York City in February 2000. So I was living not far from there at the time, and I saw that Robert Anton Wilson was speaking, and so I went to it. And at that event, I first saw Grant Morrison speak and Doug Rushkoff speak, and I searched out their work after that, and read The Invisibles, Animal Man, etc., and read Rushkoff's Coercion and Media Virus, and then just became a fan of both of their works. Dude, 17 years later, I reached out to him when I was writing the Wilson book, and yeah, this was a cold call, if you will. And I told him who I was, and I was writing the book. And, I have to say that in writing the book and doing the interviews, I interviewed like at least 50 people, and many of the people were really great, really gracious, had a lot of time for me, like online, and some even on the phone. But Morrison was like, "Oh, you want to interview me? Yeah, I'll be in New York in about 6 weeks. Let's hang out." And I was like, "What?" So I was like, "You talking to me?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay." And it was great. So I kind of lined it up with meeting up with him. I myself and my girlfriend, the Semiotic Alchemist, we interviewed him when we met up with him in Brooklyn. And that interview then was put out in 2 parts on mondo2000.com initially. And then it was put out on my own website and whatnot. It's called Magic Works. I interviewed, I don't know, after that. So I interviewed Morrison a number of times after that. I think, over the next few years. And so it was just sort of like that, really. It was just very, sort of casual. And he was in town. He was in New York at the time because they were filming his Happy, his comic book graphic novel that became a TV show that was put out on Netflix, directed by Brian Taylor. And so then we just kind of stayed in touch after that, during the writing of the book. And he was very encouraging.
He's always been a bucket list guest for this show. I've never been able to find a line of to be able to get through to him. So maybe I'll pick your brain later. But I know Richard Metzger tried to set it up ages ago, but I think at that time he was even less approachable. This was like 2008 or something, I think, but 2009. But also I don't think we'd been around very long at that point, so I was probably pushing my luck a bit. But no, he seems like the perfect guest for this show. But also I just love his work as well. I think he's brilliant. But also Vrishkov, I mean, we've had Doug on quite a few times. He's also another great guy. How did he factor into the equation?
Well, Doug as well. I kind of started speaking with Doug, or had an email correspondence and whatnot. I first interviewed Doug in 2006 or 2007. So I mean, that's a number of years before meeting Grant. Kind of same deal. I was writing for Reality Sandwich at the time, and this is how I met Bob in 2003. I mean, I didn't have anything I was writing for at the time, but I said, I'm a writer. I would like to interview Wilson for a magazine I made up, and in writing the book, Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, like a number of like really interesting thinkers and writers had the same exact experience with Bob. Like they just made up an excuse to interview him. They didn't even have like a real magazine. They just made it up, and Wilson. And this was one of the things that so many people said, was that Wilson had time. He had time to give to these young unknown people who then would later go on to make some really great stuff. I know Greg Bishop, the writer, is someone who had a similar experience, that he just sort of made up a magazine, and he interviewed Bob. And so I did the same thing with Rushkoff, essentially. Oh no, I like I said, I was writing for Reality Sandwich, right? But I guess I used, like so many people, I used that pulpit to hang out and meet people I wanted to meet. And, Bob did that with Timothy Leary in 1964 when he wrote Timothy Leary's Psychological H-Bomb, an article that was published in the Realist magazine. I mean, that's what writers do, right? They just, that's one of the things you get to do. Just use excuses to meet cool people. And so I met Doug, I think it was around 2000. Yeah, it was 2007. And that was at some book event or something in New York City. And just stayed in correspondence with him, basically engaging with him and his ideas, like, him, Doug, Morrison, and Wilson, like, and then the Disinfo website, like immediately right after that Disinfo conference, like the seeds of this book, one could say, were even at that Disinfo conference, right? Found even through my going to that event, because there you had Bob was the headliner, but you then had like the next generation after him who were, giving props to him and also representing what they were about. And so it makes complete sense to hear you say that the Invisibles had a similar tone to Illuminatus. I think Morrison is on record somewhere of saying that he wanted to create an Illuminatus of the 90s, which I think, he did, right? I think he definitely did. That was still my favorite comic book that I've ever read. I feel like The Invisibles, right? And so that event was monumental for me, and the Disinfo conference that took place there at Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City. So yeah, Are You Serious spoke at that as well, right? That event. Kenneth Anger spoke at that event.
Had that amazing intro by Richard Metzger as well. The where he said like, "I've seen the Illuminatus and it is us" or something. That's great. I've watched that. I had the DVD, so I've watched that DVD many times. It's fantastic. It was that was a great period of time as well, when Metzger was running Disinfo. It was just a great community and kind of resource, I suppose, for and all the books he put out, all the Book of Lies and the what was it, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex. There's that one, and there's a couple. There's a few, wasn't there? There's a big chunky Disinfo collections kind of thing. They were great.
They did, yeah, for a few years there, right? It was like a full library they were kicking out. Yeah, they were really inspiring. Everything You Know Is Wrong. I remember that book. That seemed to be the best. It was Russell Kirk, right? Was that the editor there? Those are great books. Yeah, I love too that they were so big as well, right?
Yeah. One of my co-hosts, I do a podcast for Patreon with a guy called Alan Greenfield, and Greenfield wrote an article for the Book of Lies, I think it's called, which is the big black magic book that they put out, which is it's fantastic. I still love that book. It's got loads of really great stuff in it.
It does. I agree. I used to have those books. I'm kind of bummed that they've left my library. Morrison wrote a really cool article in there, right, for the Book of Lies thing. I think, right, that was about like corporate sigils and stuff that. That was a very interesting sort of line that he was exploring at that time. That notion of like magic and corporate sigils, right? For me, my mind goes to this place. Then Banksy has that whole idea of brandalism, right? So flipping the notion of vandalism, right? Like that all these brands are and their signs are constantly that's vandalism, that we have to constantly take in all these logos all the time, right? And I just thought that was really fascinating. Flipping the script.
One thing I've always sort of been interested in with Bob Wilson was his politics, because he was kind of especially now, he seems to appeal. If you ever go on the Robert Anton Wilson Facebook group, it's an interesting place. Let's put it that way. It's a battlefield, is what I call it. Really, I mean, it's and it's kind of interesting because he's kind of libertarian in the old sense, isn't he? I talked to Joe Matheny about this quite a lot. This kind of, he was kind of, it almost feels like libertarianism changed since Bob died. It kind of became hyper associated with the right wing, whereas I would kind of associate Bob with the left wing. But also he just seems to appeal to both sides, and that's quite interesting. Usually, if you have someone that's political in their writing, they tend to. I've just been reading Mark Fisher a lot recently, and he's very left wing, so he generally appeals to the left and is heavily criticized by the right, whereas Bob seems to be appreciated by both sides. And I think maybe that's due to this kind of libertarianism, and maybe it's been misinterpreted by some people as a kind of right-wing modern libertarianism. I don't know, does that make sense?
Oh, complete sense. Yeah, Ken, totally. I mean, I think that that sort of right-wing appropriation, if you will, of Wilson's sort of political message is probably due to Illuminatus trilogy, because I think people might describe it, even when they say, "Oh, libertarian, man, check this out." And also it won a libertarian book award, in the 80s, 1986, I think. And so, but yeah, Wilson's libertarianism, though, it's rooted in, even Wilson's libertarian anarchism it's rooted in the individualist anarchist movement of the American individualist anarchist movement of the 1800s, really. And that's a that's a different, it should even have a different name, if you will, than exactly what gets called sort of libertarianism today, or how it's generally associated. That sort of libertarian socialism that Bob was into was represented in the 70s and even in the 90s. It was called, left libertarianism. Like, there was a category of people who leaned left, and they believed in, the civil liberties. It's not a hard thing to grasp, Carl Oglesby was another representation of that left libertarianism. Timothy Leary was left libertarian. In the 90s to the aughts, the 2000s, there was that sort of test that you could take or whatever to see, Wilson was libertarian in the sense of libertarian is on the pole of, the spectrum of authoritarianism, right? Like, you're on that spectrum. You're authoritarian personality, or you're like a libertarian sort of personality, right? You're fundamentalist, or you're liberal minded, right? You're flexible, or you're rigid. And Wilson was flexible, but in the sense of like what gets classically represented as libertarian, he believed in individual rights. He often he summed up his philosophy like this, in a way, like which was a sort of paraphrase from this earlier writer, I think Spengler, which was like no one in the world will be completely happy until everyone is happy, right? So like, and where he takes it then too is like, an individual can't be totally free until like part of that freedom is helping other people become fully free individuals. Like, that's part of the package. Like, you can't become a free person while other people around you are enslaved. It doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? Like, and of course, many people try. You could go to some island somewhere, and then there's a whole country of slaves, and somehow you're free, but you probably feel like shit because of it. But Wilson takes on the sort of Bodhisattva vow, right? And I think that that appeals to maybe a leftist mindset, perhaps, of like this notion of like, we're here, and I could see that we're on the lower decks of this Titanic, and there are people tap dancing on the upper decks, and they have all the champagne, yet we're all heading to this iceberg. So let's get the perspective correct, right? So so that's an interesting idea. Like, we're like that balance between thinking collectively and acting individually, like that old phrase, like think global, act local, right? Same deal with, what Wilson is seeking, Wilson's type of libertarianism, which again, I think it just is easily described perhaps as like a sort of left libertarian. But just because he never liked to get easily categorized, I think that he would just throw a spanner in the works just to throw people off sometimes, like and that was just his trickster mind. When it came to politics, I think that he didn't want, because there's so many associations that then people make, like, oh, you're left, well, you're this, like, you're this, you're that, because of this, because you're that. Like, all of his work is about breaking the associations of how our minds work, and putting awareness on the fact that we associate. So his work is drawn to, like, he'll have you questioning, like, okay, well, emotionally, leftist politics appeals to something in you. Why is that? I find that from Wilson's work, right? Even though I still feel the same sort of, I guess, politically, in an abstract, as I did in my younger years, I feel like Wilson has done the job of a proper philosopher to make his readers think about why they think the way they do. But that being said, as I put in my book, Chapel Perilous, The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, he was in the sort of early libertarian scene, the thing that becomes the American libertarian movement, right? The political party, libertarianism, but he was writing for, and maybe he felt the same way as this libertarian writer, this man named Samuel Edward Konkin III, who had a newsletter or a journal called the New Libertarian Weekly, and in 1976 they interviewed Wilson, and then afterward he started writing articles for the journal, of which he explored libertarianism proper, and then contrasted that with the American individualist anarchist libertarians, people like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner. And what would eventually come from those articles was his pamphlet, Natural Law, or Don't Put a Rubber on Your Willie, that pamphlet that he put out, which was a criticism of the idea of natural law that he thought was a lot of libertarians sort of held as axiomatic, as a truth, which is this idea that we're born with this, God-given, we're born with these rights, and as George Carlin would later put in a special, it's like, you don't have any rights, meaning these are socially constructed. Everything that we have, all these rights and all these notions that we as humans have, are totally socially constructed. So Wilson was in the mix with, libertarian thinkers, yet he's not in the von Mises Institute crew. He's not even so much in, the Cato Institute at all, really. I mean, although there are people who probably write for both, and I know there are people who write for both, who were influenced by Wilson's sort of libertarianism. I think it's because he was talking about libertarianism in the 70s, because that idea was so new. Like in the 1970s, libertarianism blew up in popularity in terms of the amount of books that were published dedicated to that as a subject. In the 60s, it really wasn't a huge topic of discussion. And it was mostly anarchism that perhaps became a part of that discussion. But as people were speaking, they found that they had slightly different takes on what sort of anarchism that they were into, And Bob really, in 1962, really early, he discovered, as I keep going back to, like someone like Benjamin R. Tucker and the individualist American anarchists. And that was through him going to this place called the School of Living, which was like an institution in Ohio that were teaching these thinkers, these forgotten thinkers, and they've gone down the memory hole of American history. But in the 70s, I think there was the rise of this libertarianism as a kind of scene, if you will. And then Murray Rothbard, who is sort of like the bard of that era, he's also writing about Benjamin R. Tucker, right? But Bob has a different interpretation of Benjamin R. Tucker as well. So there's a bifurcation that is occurring in that early scene. And Wilson is kind of on the camp, perhaps. Samuel Edward Konkin III, who is, as I said, the editor of New Libertarian Weekly, he is not a fan of the forming Libertarian Party. He thinks that libertarianism, what are you forming a political party for? It's about transcending all of this. There shouldn't be a Libertarian Party. You're already going to open yourself up to corrupting elements, which I would say Konkin believed that happened when the Koch brothers came around and pumped all this money into the Libertarian Party, and some might say essentially took it over. And the Koch brothers are these American big money guys who like to meddle with politics and play that sort of marionette game. And, Edward Konkin, Samuel Edward Konkin and Wilson, Samuel Edward Konkin called the people who were influenced by the Koch brothers, he called them cokeheads, right? And he wasn't with it. He wasn't with where that was going. And so, yeah, there was the rise of this distinction, this left libertarianism that Wilson was definitely a part of. Where it eventually goes, I think it's really only in the aughts, the 2000s, and then the internet, where it seemed to have taken this notion of libertarianism and just associated it with this right-wing suburban brosphere of like, you're just reiterating suburban like tropes that fifth graders are repeating, but somehow you're calling it libertarian because you want to say the N-word or something like that,
Yeah, it's mad. I remember when I think I was still in the ATO at the time, there was a guy, I forget his name, Augustus Sol Invictus, I think his name was. He was this member of the ATO that he went off into the desert and slayed a goat, and then wrote this kind of magical text, sent it to all the heads of the of the OTO and the AA, and said, "Oh, this is the next Class A text." Class A being, a high spiritual text. If Crowley wrote something in Class A, it was from the gods, kind of thing. And then, and I always remember he was a big Robert Anton Wilson fan, but he then went off. Was part of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and ran as a libertarian candidate, and he was always citing Robert Anton Wilson. I always thought it was so strange. It was like, to me, that I spent many years reading Bob Wilson, and what his version of libertarianism seemed so removed from Bob's, and it was so weird. It's such a strange. I never saw that coming. I never saw the kind of right wing angle coming. I suppose it just shocked me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there are a few people out there that I do scratch my head sometimes, and I wonder, how did Bob influence you exactly? But yeah, and then it's interesting. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but I find this interesting right now, doing a few interviews here and there, and like most of them have been amazing, man, like as is this one. But I find it funny when people like criticize Wilson's work from like the 70s as if he's a contemporary today, just in the sense of wanting to just poo-poo his work, just wanting to be like, well, he was wrong, and he's what is it, like spiritually immature? I heard that. Like, what does that mean exactly, man? And I think that he would get a kick out of a lot of this sort of stuff. And I mean, I have nothing against selling courses. I mean, get your money, man. I mean, he did it too, but like, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting realm of where we're at now, like where people receive the message. Like so many people today, these days, right? If they haven't even, who are discovering Wilson, they're discovering him through the internet. Through old videos and whatnot, and talks and podcasts even about him. And then I guess that they're young searchers are maybe doing the same thing when it comes to like a magical path, right? They're looking online, and people who are selling these programs. Like, I think Wilson's lesson is to get you looking sideways at that to begin with. Like, I mean, just open a book, read the book, man, read Crowley. It's right there, read the book, but again, I understand we're in this new interesting era of internet, and we are in a new phase of it, I believe, since Trump. Like the Eunice Yiannopoulos has a very great phrase, the Greek political activist. He calls it the brolarchy, oligarchy. I'm stumbling on that word, but meaning, this rise of the tech bro. They were all at Trump's inauguration, and Elon
there's
Musk,
a whole there's a magical crossover with some of those guys as well. It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of research recently because we're going to start doing video stuff soon for the channel, and I've been looking into a lot of some of the influences of like people like Peter Thiel and like Steve Bannon, who isn't really a tech guy, I suppose, but he's Trump adjacent. But it's funny how some of the occult stuff seeps into that as well. And obviously you've got I don't know if you know about them, but like the CCRU in the UK Nick Land, all these sort of people, they all kind of feed into this. They're all kind of like weird post-raw kind of I don't know what you call them really. Like it's like raw gone wrong. It's probably what I'd call it, kind of stuff. But it's but it's interesting. I think for me, one of the biggest things I always see for Robert Anton Wilson is how he becomes, for a lot of people, a gateway into magic, or a gateway into Crowley, especially. Did you find that a lot of? I mean, a lot of people, especially when I was in the ATO, a lot of people found out about Crowley through Wilson, and obviously that book came out fairly recently, the Unpublished. Was it the Lion of Light? I think it was called.
Light. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So obviously, and it wasn't. I think I remember reading ages ago. Wasn't he going to release a different version of that book at one point? It was like a more sort of thorough kind of look at Crowley, and kind of like almost like a manual for using his magic or something. It was a bit more broad than the one that came out eventually.
Yes.
But clearly Crowley had a big influence on him, and he managed to push Crowley out to a lot of other people. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Would you agree with that? Or
100%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think I would have encountered Crowley's work if it weren't for Robert Anton Wilson. Wilson's ability to introduce ceremonial magic to another generation of people, right? I think that, or generations of people, really, and it was like, because of the way he wrote, because of Wilson's terse, erudite, punchy, humorous way that he, described everything, he acted as like this great countercultural public intellectual of taking in all these current, highly jargonized fields of study, and ceremonial magic, and Thelema being one of them, as well as Buckminster Fuller and general semantics and analytical philosophy and like imaginary numbers. Like, Wilson was able to take all of these different language systems and just, as Peter Carroll said, put them through the jet engine of his mind, and the exhaust was just the creation of this synthesis that he was constantly able to do. Like, he was a great dialectician, Bob. Like, he was a master at the dialect. Like, he knew how to take the thesis and then present the antithesis and create a new synthesis all the time in his work. And so he did that, I believe, like with Crowley. I mean, but I don't claim any sort of expertise in Thelemic magic. I'm not associated with any magical organization. Again, most of the stuff, Wilson was my gateway drug into Crowley's work. But Wilson, and then again, he's part of a generation too. So I'd say Wilson and Tower Records, right? The old record store that used to exist. Tower Records, where I grew up, was like right next to the bookstore. So the bookstore had maybe one Robert Anton Wilson book, but Tower Records like had a back room where I grew up, and they had like all the New Falcon books. So that was Robert Anton Wilson's publisher, and Tim Leary's books, Christopher Hyatt, Aleister Crowley, The Eye in the Triangle, Israel Regardie's biography of Crowley. So I think Wilson is I can't even speak about other guides. I mean, maybe Lon Milo Duquette was the other writer that I've read that's been able to sort of break down these the rituals and the Crowleyan curriculum, if you will, and for me personally too, like, I think and that's the great thing about a mind like Wilson's, is his mind is so large, right? And he's into so many different things. He appeals to these people into these different things. So he was into paganism and computers, so like in the early 80s, like there were people discovering his work, like who later would go on to become like, high, and like they might write for Wired magazine. Like the 90s was about the fusion of paganism and computers, but in the 70s and the 80s, those are two separate things still. Mm-hmm. And so Wilson was a voice for that, and that book, that you speak of, Lion of Light, which was recently published. And you're correct. I have it in my book, the story behind that, because I accessed that book as well. What became Lion of Light. It's held at the Houghton Library, Special Collections at Harvard University. Anyone could access that, right? But I encourage you to buy the book, right?
But wasn't there? He wrote an article, I think, didn't he, for a pagan magazine? And there was in that, or it was like a letters page or a website or something. I can't remember. And he was talking about a book of the same name, but with a very different description of what the actual manuscript was. If that makes sense. Like it was.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Well, it makes sense. Yes, I put that in the book. I mean, I discovered that. That was So you're speaking about the letters page in a pagan magazine called Green Egg.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was, I guess the premier sort of pagan, neo-pagan magazine at the time. This was before a glossy cover, though. And in 1974, Wilson wrote in the letters page there that he was working on a book that he was called Lion of Light. And it was a biography of Crowley, but also an exploration of the Wiccan tradition, and then therefore Crowley, because Gerald Gardner, who is the British occultist who is credited, I suppose, with starting Wicca, I guess had said that he'd studied with Crowley as well, and so Wilson found a golden thread from what he was practicing with Wicca to Crowley. And then in the letters page to Green Egg, he was saying that he believed that this was like, a thread that went all the way back to, pre-Christian era, to the cult of Dianus or Janus. And so what he wanted to do was, synthesize all his knowledge on Crowley that he was doing at the time with Wicca, with this idea that was popular in the 70s, especially with the pagan movement at the time, which was called the witch cult hypothesis. And that was most popularly expressed by the writer named, what's her name again? Murray. Her name escapes me at the moment, but she wrote a book called The Witch Cult Hypothesis, which was the notion that the witch trials that had occurred in Europe, that today we kind of just attribute to like a mass hysteria and fear of the female. I probably, you know what I mean, like fear of the period. But the so what this writer was saying was that this was actually these were witches, right? These women were witches, but they weren't in league with Satan. They were actually practicing a religious culture that preceded Christianity and kind of went underground in Europe because of how nice and fuzzy the Christians were to non-believers, And so they continued this cult, and the cult was like basically a fertility cult that just let people become more Dionysic. It was like an orgy. They were having like with the idea with the horned god, which is an image within paganism, and which is seen by, I guess, Christian fundamentalists as a representation of Satan, but is a different thing within paganism. It's a fertility deity, and so that was the witch cult hypothesis. And Wilson was writing in the pages of Green Egg how he wanted to present the synthesis. He said that he sent that book off to a publisher. I think I knew who the publisher was. I tried for a long time to find that book. I contacted the publisher, who was a friend of his or someone he knew from perhaps the School of Living days. And his name escapes me at the moment, but it's in my book. And and I couldn't, the publisher, the guy was dying at the time when I was contacting him. And so I was having conversations with his Haitian, I guess, nurse, but like they were like friends. She was a very funny lady, very live, and she was cool. And but she was like, I can't find what you're talking about. And then I don't know how much time went by. All of a sudden, a story came out about how Line of Light was found in the Houghton Library, and it was purchased from someone in England, which I find interesting. I don't know how it got over there, but that Line of Light, right? That name Line of Light was the publishers of the Line of Light that's out right now. So that they took the name from that Bob book that was unpublished, because the title that Bob was using for the book that is now Line of Light, it's like a long title. And I forget, I have it in my book. I forget the name of the title, but it's in my book. So Line of Light makes way more sense. It's a much easier thing.
Easier to remember.
Yeah.
So one thing, Bob always used to identify himself. Actually, before I say, someone in the chat asks if were you in Jersey at the time? Sounds like Tower Records set up in Paramus back in the day. Is that it?
Paramus, New Jersey. I've never been to. I don't know if I've been to Paramus. This is in Long Island. I grew up in Long Island.
Yeah. And also, same guy, Early Richard, said Crowley signed Gardner's charter. I think, wasn't that for the OTO? Though didn't Crowley sign, because Gardner was going to start an OTO at one point, wasn't he? A camp or a lodge. I've got a feeling it was that.
I think you would know better than me. I can't say anything.
I could be wrong. Gardner's not my strong point at all. Wicca, I need to read about a lot more. Mark, one of my co-hosts, is well versed in Wicca. But,
I would say, I think at the time, maybe Bob believed so in that mid-70s period.
Yeah. So at the time, a lot of the times, I remember he talks about this a lot in the Maybe Logic film. But Bob sort of identifies himself as a guerrilla ontologist. And I've always found that quite confusing, if I'm honest. Do you have any way of describing what a guerrilla ontologist is?
For sure, yeah. And I understand the confusion. He like that though a bit, didn't he? He liked.
Yeah, he used to sign it, didn't he? Guerrilla ontologist. I emailed him a few times, and it would always come up in his signature, Robert Anton Wilson, guerrilla ontologist.
Lovely.
In the signature at the bottom for a while. But so I always, those two words don't seem to mix particularly well when I look them up.
I discussed this in the book, and when it comes to when exactly Wilson came up with the term, I'm not very clear. But what he used then to describe, the definition of that term is, it's similar to Gonzo, Hunter S. Thompson's Gonzo style, like new journalism, right? So a great example of Wilson's guerrilla ontology, which is essentially, is his book, The Widow's Son, right? So that's a fiction book. And Wilson went full guerrilla ontologist in that book, meaning he's writing about historical fiction, but he's making up some facts along the way. So they're not facts. He's making up shit. And but he's weaving it into the historical narrative, and he's doing that on purpose, though. It's not just to be a compulsive liar. It's really to inspire the reader to go out and want to learn about this historical event. That's essentially it. I'd say, like a loose definition is, guerrilla ontology is just utilizing, just retelling a historical event in your own way, like how Norman Mailer kind of described, fiction writing, or as lying that tells a deeper truth than the truth, if you will.
That's a bit like the filmmaker Werner Herzog. He always says he always tries to distinguish between fact and truth. I've always loved this. It's kind of something I try to follow myself, I suppose, with my films and stuff. But it's this idea that he always says that if facts were the most important thing, then the New York phone directory would be the book of books. You know, it'd be because it's full of facts, but it doesn't actually tell you anything about the people within it. It just tells you, information. Whereas, you should be kind of always looking to, present a truth of a thing, even if it means embellishing sometimes the facts, kind of thing. And that's definitely something you get with Bob's work as well. So maybe that's partially what he means. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I love that description of it, right? Because we return to of like, what is the mission of an artist and what is the notion of art? And I want to be very clear of like, this biography is a biography of an artist, right? It's a person who chose to live his life as an artist, and then what he encountered along the way, hence Chapel Perilous. Like, it was not easy for him to live as an artist then, and I don't think it got any easier for anyone seeking to live as artists today, right? Yes. So like, what messages of nutrition can we receive through the way that this man lived his life? Like that's what I think this book is about, and it's what I think humanities is supposed to be really all about, is like, what inspiration can you draw from other human beings who lived on this planet, not shit that we made up, but actual people who lived here and have something to share, even if it's just a little bit of value to help make your life that much better. And Wilson has that in droves, and as do so many other writers, and especially his generation, because I agree with him that we live in this, history is this period of exponentially increasing information. So every generation that's born, people living today, we see so many more images and we read so many more words than in the past ever. And, I agree with Burroughs in a sense that language is a virus, man. Like, it might not be healthy to always be reading all these words all the time. You know what I mean? Like, to really fully experience a moment, right? To be trapped on a page or stuck on the blue light of a computer screen, right? We easily mistake the map for the territory then, right? And Wilson's work is all about bringing you back to your own perceptual understanding of the world, that like, and so I'm sort of losing focus here, like getting off course with what I was saying. But in terms of guerrilla ontology, it is very fitting, because and getting at the truth, the fact of the matter, as W.B. Yeats, I believe, said, like, man cannot really speak of the truth, he can only embody the truth, right? Like, so I think that's why when you read a book like Cosmic Trigger versus, say, some book that comes out, how many books that come out that speak about the same theories and ideas that Wilson is talking about, yet there's a tin quality to it. There's a hollow, echoey, empty, vapid feel to some of the discussions that come out in some of the books of a similar flavor. But Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, that's another good example of Wilson's guerrilla ontology, if we equate it to the new journalism movement that occurred like in the 50s and 60s and whatnot, which Wilson was heavily influenced by, heavily influenced by Norman Mailer in terms of, new journalism was this style of writing journalism that put the writer at the center of the story. And Hunter S. Thompson was the perennial, paragon of this, right? He was telling all types of ridiculous tales, absolutely not true. Yet Hunter S. Thompson went out to cover a motorcycle derby rally in Las Vegas, right? But that becomes Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, because he went deeper with it, whatever he was doing, right? And like, that's where we are today, like with great artists, like perhaps for you it's Werner Herzog, for Bob it was Orson Welles, right? Orson Welles was his guru, artist, teacher, and And that was Wells's biggest message was the unreliable narrator. You know, and this is the world we live in, man. We're all unreliable narrators, and you know, you can only get part of the story from one person, and that's all of us. And that's the whole point for Wilson about communication. Like, we have to learn how to widen our expanse to keep the channels open, even with people that we hate, you know, or people that we feel like are completely off and wrong, and that's extremely difficult. But I don't know.
And becoming rare these days as well. I mean, there seems to be that as people push off into their own little extremes, the dialogue between these two opposing sort of sides is getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and that's to me, that's an incredibly worrying thing. You know, I always think that dialogue's quite important.
100%. Yeah, I mean, it's a niche culture that's developing, and then people's like spikies are coming out, and everyone's a piece of shit. You know, anyone who doesn't agree with you, yeah, well, you know, like so and so is a piece of shit. Yeah. So when it comes to, but one last thing, like of wondering where exactly, you know, because Bob was working this sort of method, this what he calls guerrilla ontology, you know, early on in his career. Yet, I do wonder where the term itself comes from, because he might have co-opted it from a review of his work by the skeptic Robert Schaefer. You know, so, and then Bob took the review from the Skeptical Inquirer that Schaefer wrote about one of Wilson's books, and then he put it at the beginning of his Prometheus Rising book, and he put it right before chapter 1, and it says, it's great. So it says, warning, Wilson describes himself as a guerrilla ontologist. Okay, so no, nix that. However, so meaning Wilson already was using this term. Like, it could have even gone back to the realist days. Like he could have really.
I've got a feeling he did get it from somewhere. For some reason I seem to remember him. There was that collection of audio stuff that came out called, I think, like Raw Explains Everything. I've listened to that hundreds of times. I remember when I was before I got into sort of journalism and film, I used to have a job drawing maps for an electricity company, as you do, and you could listen to audiobooks, and for a long time the only collection of audiobooks I had was that Robert Anton Wilson set. So I listened to it over and over and over again. I'm sure somewhere in there he sort of cites where he got it from. I'm sure it's from, like you say, either a review or someone else used it, and because I mean, right where you're sitting now, you know, that was borrowed from William Burroughs. That wasn't his title. William Burroughs originally published a book called Right Where You're Sitting Now. So he was a borrower, but I don't know if that's, you know, I don't know. I'd have to look that up. Maybe I can, you know, maybe I can find that later. But
he was a master of pastiche, and I think I put that in my book. I might have it in my book where he got the origin of guerrilla ontology, or it's in my book too. I think it's in my book where he took the title of Right Where You're Sitting Now. He asked Burroughs if he could use that title for Bob was in the 70s, like around 77. Like Cosmic Trigger is interesting. It's like he was working on like 3 different books at the same time. Like, you know, this book called Death Shall Have No Dominion, which is about life extension. And then he was working on that Crowley book. Right. And then that's where that chart in Cosmic Trigger, there's 2 very interesting charts, like the one about the quantum physics experiments, right, that were going on at the time. And then there was the chart that sort of relates Crowley to the you know, pre-Christian Gnostics, right, in that. And I believe that was basically a chart he was working with for what he was going to use for that Lion and Light book. And then he also took sections. He was working on a book that eventually got re-released posthumously, the Starseed Signals, and that was a book that was basically all about mostly Timothy Leary and why he thought Leary was such an important thinker and philosopher, and why he thought Leary should not be in jail or in prison. And there was not huge sections, but definitely sections like word for word from starseed signals that then gets put in Cosmic Trigger. So that's what's so fascinating about Wilson. And I really seek to reflect that in the book, was, again, coming back to the notion that, like, Bob was all these things. He was a public intellectual of the counterculture. He was an extremely funny satirical novelist and whatnot. Like, but my approach was just pulling back again, like pulling back the frame, like who was this person, right? Well, he was an artist, right? And what did he encounter living in this world as an artist, as he did? And that calls back to our earlier sort of brief discussion about libertarianism. He was that's the type of libertarianism and anarchism that he was into. He was like, he expressed it through his art, right? Mm-hmm. And he drew inspiration from Oscar Wilde in that regard, and James Joyce. I don't know if one could say that James Joyce, quote unquote, was an anarchist, right? But Joyce was very much aware and influenced by Mikhail Bakunin, right? And also Benjamin R. Tucker. So Joyce has the two best voices of anarchism at the time, sort of informing his art. And where Joyce takes it is to become a more like I don't know, self-reliant, it could be self-reliant, sort of artistic individual. Like, the key to being like a real individual and like true civilian is to harness the powers that you already have as an artist. For me, I think like magic is sort of like building the engine, but like, what's the result, man? The result is your work, the work outside of your dream diary. It's the creation that you create, the artifact that you leave to the world, and so, and then one doesn't need magic to get there, but one could just, Lon Milo Duquette sort of describes magic as anything done with an intention and concentration. So art is a great expression of magic and whatnot. And this is what makes Bob, master magician, not just for his nonfiction work, but for the way that he was able to craft his fiction, as great, very good and great writers do, right? They hypnotize the reader and seduce the reader to infuse, like, you literally see what they're talking about through the power of the, juxtaposition of the words and syllables that they use, and Wilson found liberation in that, and the ability to, be a one-man temporary autonomous zone. And this is the truth, man. I mean, this is right where you are sitting now, right? That's, to me, that's the whole point of his book, is like, people can tune in with meditating, and you kind of like ground, you put the stake in the ground and you connect, but you put it to work through artistic or scientific creation, according to Wilson. And that's magical. And for him, that's what he gets from Oscar Wilde as well. Like, you're most free, most libertarian when you are in the act of creating something wonderful, and
yeah. It's interesting. Before I let you go, there's one era of Wilson that was always fascinated me, and it kind of seems to happen to a lot of people that I'm interested in. There seems to be this sort of pivotal sort of spiritual intrusion that happens with a lot of people. So like Crowley, you could say it was the Iwas incident. Timothy Leary had an incident. Philip K. Dick had the pink laser incident. You could even say maybe that David Icke had a similar experience. I'm not a particular fan of David Icke, but it's this thing where they seem to have almost like a breakdown, or like a transmission that causes a great emotional or kind of, I don't know what you call it, it's like a download of information. And Bob Wilson had his Sirius incident, didn't he? I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about that, like how it occurred and how he interpreted it more importantly? Because it seems that a similar thing seems to happen to all these types of people, and they all seem to interpret it and sort of filter it out in different ways. But yeah.
Heck yeah. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I mean, you're correct, right? That notion of some sort of downloading of a massive amount of information, or, I think Crowley describes it as like a just brain change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's in the beginning of book 4. Crowley describes, like, talks about Jesus, Buddha, and Paul, Saul of Tarsus, and, how they had an immediate sort of life-changing event, and at least Saul to St. Paul, blinded by the light and then turned totally into a different person or whatever, and then, I think that's what Crowley's saying in book 4, is that, that's what magic is, in a way, is like this willed brain change, like, and then years later, even the transpersonal philosopher, Ken Wilber, kind of talks about that in a way too, like how these people like Lao Tzu, Jesus, Buddha, and whatnot, they're sort of like evolutionary, presaging our evolution. Like they are what we could become, in a way. But first, perhaps one goes through that massive brain change event. And for Bob, which he describes wonderfully in Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, his 1977 book. That's his description of his time, which he calls going through Chapel Perilous. So the path through Chapel Perilous is a very important one to attain this higher level of consciousness, if you will, or a sort of brain, higher level of, like, brain capacity, maybe. And so for Bob, I suppose that, the way he starts it is that, I guess it sort of happened through first exploring the magic of Aleister Crowley. Although he was already attuned to a sort of magical way of life to begin with, but he discovered Aleister Crowley in 1970 when Alan Watts, a friend and mentor, great British philosopher, who recommended Israel Regardie's book, The Eye and the Triangle, to Wilson over lunch and martinis one day. And Wilson, discovered Timothy Leary and Zen Buddhism through Alan Watts. So, of course, he checked out this book and he loved it, Israel Regardie's book. He started a correspondence with Regardie. When he moved to Mexico in 1971, he tried to join the OTO, but he didn't get a response. He sent a letter to Grady McMurtry and Phyllis Sackler McMurtry at that time. But so he started the Crowleyan curriculum, right? And that Crowleyan curriculum that then Wilson writes about in the Lion of Light book that we were discussing earlier. That's a great book for, just going through the list and of to-do list, if you will, the recipe for attaining this wild state of mind that he eventually talks about, where he went in the mid 70s. And this was a place where he believed that he was, I have in the book that he took the oath of the abyss, which is that, your kind of total dedication to receiving any information that is really a communication from your holy guardian angel. He built his way up to, he believed, and you tell me, like, he believed that the jewel of Crowley's magical mission was to teach people to attain knowledge and conversation with their holy guardian angel, and then receive the true will, right? Their true will. So he took that very seriously. Bob, his whole approach to magic was like everything. It was a transcendental. It was, how do I transcend my emotional compulsions? My sort of my anger, my paranoia, my anxiety, my pain. How do I transcend this to get to this other state? And so he used everything, magic, acid, everything towards this mission, really, for the most part. And so he writes that, in 1971, in the spring of 1971, when he was in San Miguel Allende, well, let's just say when he was in Mexico, he was reading from Crowley's Book of Lies, and reading a passage there, he entered Chapel Perilous, right? And he entered Chapel Perilous because he believed he read within, one of those sections, like the secret magical jewel of Book of Lies, which is basically sex magic, right?
Yeah.
And so Wilson just continues on this sort of magical path, studying Crowley and then doing tons of acid. And then at the same time, he is questioning who's the Illuminati really. And, he's doing that as a writer as well, right? Like he's exploring this trope. He just put out an 800-page book about the Illuminati. He knows that he's hot, right? And he knows that he's got to deliver something that people are going to associate. He's a little bit typecasted at the moment, but he does something well with it. So in the Illuminatus trilogy, the Illuminati is just this trope to play with, right? It doesn't really exist according to Wilson, but when it's a historical thing that did exist, right? But when he's in the state of mind while he's writing Illuminatus, Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, he's really questioning now, like, does the Illuminati actually exist? But not only do they exist, but maybe they're not as bad as everyone makes them out to be, because when I look at what the Bavarian Illuminati were about, they were basically libertarians, or liberals. They wanted to break free from an authoritarian Catholic Church and have individual rights. Like there's nothing wrong with that, right? But Wilson he goes deeper in the conspiratorial lore, and but his mind is always turning things over. So he, at some point in the mid-70s, he's questioning whether the Illuminati were also like a positive sex cult, because so many things today, even like all these things coming out about Diddy and Epstein and other people, right? Like rich, powerful freakazoids who partake in all these sex parties, but there's something coercive and not like libertine or liberatory about it. It's a weird, it's eyes wide shut. And, Bob was getting rid of the paranoia and saying, like, maybe these are like sex yogis who are really discovering some higher states of consciousness. And maybe there's something to this Illuminati thing. And during this time, he believes he's receiving messages from his holy guardian angel, who he thinks exists somewhere in the constellation of Sirius, the Sirius constellation. And they're being somehow telepathically transmitted to him, these messages, and they're encoded within synchronicities around the number 23. And he believes this at the time or he lets himself believe this at the time because while he's, as I was saying, he was doing all this Crowleyan magic work on July 22nd or July 23rd, because he wakes up. He does like an experiment on June 6th, 1973. And he takes some acid and he goes in a darkened room and he listens to John C. Lilly tape called Beliefs Unlimited, which is a very interesting tape. It's all about transcending your limiting beliefs, right? And then he puts on a tape of a Crowley ritual designed to, I guess, get one in touch with their holy guardian angel. And I don't know if it's Liber Samek or what, but Bob kind of remixes the Crowley message, right? So, right, because I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I guess the old way of attaining knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel was to read that old book, which I forget now.
It's the Abramelin working was one of them, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes. And as you know, and as your listeners know, probably, like, Crowley took that, but then he condensed that to, and he created Liber Samek, of which he then gave it to, I don't know if he gave it to Bennett or someone else, as like, this is a condensed version to get you in touch with your holy guardian angel. And then, but how Crowley said that he attained it, he did it all in his head while he was trekking across China. He set up the altar in his head, and he did the holy guardian angel rituals like on the back of a donkey while like trekking across China. Don't hold me on that, but that's my take on it. But my point is, Wilson then took this and he remixed it even more, the spell, if you will, to attain this knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. So he does this ritual on June 6, 1973, and he believes he has a huge experience of seeing basically all his past lives, or all these past lives, and he goes even to the point of like a one-celled amoeba or animal. Like he has all these, and he sees all this magical imagery that I guess Crowley would talk about, that you would see or something. And 6 weeks later, he does the same thing. He listens to the tapes, the Crowley tapes, the Lily tape, but instead of doing acid, he does like a sex yoga thing with his wife Arlen, and but nothing happens. He sort of goes to bed with spiritual blue balls, if you will, right? And then he wakes up the next day from a dream, and kind of in a fevered rush, and the one message from the dream saying over and over, or maybe just once, Sirius is very important. And he writes it down. And then later on that day, he goes to his bookcase and he pulls out a book from Kenneth Grant. It was a recent book. And in that book, Grant speaks about, Sirius, and then how Crowley found the star in the AA, the silver star was Sirius, right? According to Kenneth Grant. So, Wilson takes all these wild, from Kenneth Grant, his interpretations of Crowley, which many people now would be like, wow, Kenneth Grant had a great imagination, right? And then he takes the 23 Enigma, which Wilson, learned from William Burroughs, so I have that in my book. I have the whole story about the 23 Enigma in my book. And so he then believes, he feels that there's this kind of magical link between like Crowley, Sirius, and the number 23. And so in the mid 70s there, like from 73, 74, 75, he's working with this idea that he's, being communicated to from his holy guardian angel that exists somewhere in the Sirius constellation through number 23. So he's paying attention to all these synchronicities, which are, meaningful coincidences, things that are meaningful only to you, or other people, but mostly to you. And then he this party, this party in 1974, it's this Crowley mass party. So it's October 12th, 1974. Wilson has now kind of, I wouldn't say joined the OTO. If he did, it's quiet, but he's since become friends with Grady McMurtry, who is the head of the OTO. And McMurtry opens his library to Bob. And Bob does this a lot throughout his life. Like earlier in his life, someone opened their library of Wilhelm Reich books, because Wilhelm Reich's work was destroyed in an incinerator in New York City in the 50s. And Wilson went to this person's house and like read everything, right? And so I'm sure he was doing the same thing at McMurtry's place, just reading all these Crowley texts, because like Wilson's ability to kind of just, move through the ranks in so many fields is pretty phenomenal. Like this is what makes him an extraordinary mind, right? Is that he's just able to kind of like go from white belt to brown, black belt, like extremely quickly, right? So he's doing all this work. And then on Crowley Mass, which is, Crowley's birthday? It's a celebration of Aleister Crowley, October 12th. It's also Columbus Day, I believe, right? 1974. Jacques Vallée comes over to Wilson's house. They're having a party. Someone brings Jacques Vallée, the
UFO guy.
Yeah, the UFO computer scientist, the author, and UFO thinker, if you will, philosopher. And Vallée's take is very interesting, right? He's also someone who is kind of an adherent to maybe logic, because he doesn't take the UFOs at face value, right? That they're these strange beings from outer space. He's considering so many things that perhaps these are weird relational psychological manifestations. I mean, they're outside of us, but they're related to something inside of us, in the sense that our current cultural context is to describe these things as UFOs, these unidentified flying alien objects. But as Vallee shows in his work, in earlier times, people just called these things angels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like whatever these beings are. And Wilson was no stranger to encountering weird, seemingly autonomous beings outside of himself. Like in the early 60s, when he was living in Yellow Springs, Ohio, he was one of the first people in America to be popping peyote tab. Well, one of the first white boys to be popping a lot of peyote tabs, like, and when it was legal to buy peyote through the mail, he bought a box of it and had peyote for a year. And he was doing his own scientific experiments where he was doing the peyote and encountering these sort of light beings that were outside of him, but he didn't label them as angels, demons, anything. He just called them X's, right? And so he realizes that by going into the magic world, the Thelema world, he's taking on a set of game rules, right? And he's playing along, right? And so he's saying, so he does these dedications to these different deities, like, so the dedication to Newt, the dedication to Isis, the dedication to, like, as Crowley suggests, you have to work through all these godheads, right? And so you work up your kind of spiritual muscles to then, embrace your holy guardian angel, which Wilson feels like he did, right? And that's what Cosmic Trigger is all about, right? And then so at this Crowley Mass party, Jacques Vallée blows his mind when he tells him this, that he's like, these beings are not necessarily outside of us. They could be all this other stuff. So that gets Wilson thinking that, well, who is this? Can I pin down an identity of this holy guardian angel? Because he was having psychics tell him that, like, well, you're channeling a voice from a past life. One psychic told him that he was channeling a voice from a past life of himself as an ancient Chinese bard, right? Mm-hmm. Another, he got a notion somewhere that this could have been on an acid trip, that he was like a reincarnation of like an Illuminati member named Hans Zoser from way back in the day, right? And then another psychic told him that he was channeling an ancient Irish Sanche, or Shanche, Irish bard, storyteller, psychic, right? And so he's experimenting even more, and he goes to an event, a public event from the New Reformed Order, the New Reformed Orthodox Order of the Golden Dawn, and that was like a pagan group that was founded in the 70s that Bob and Arlen, in the Bay Area, that Bob and Arlen joined up with, I'd say. And he does some acid, and he partakes in this kind of Wiccan public ceremony, which involves like dancing and kissing and like it's a very sort of romantic, nothing weird, right? Like 70s sort of thing, I guess. And he has this experience of contacting like what was it? Well, so he taps into sort of like the Celtic interpretation of what this could be, and this frees him up a little bit. That's like, oh, wait a minute, this holy guardian angel, I kind of programmed this trip a little bit. I wanted to sort of see this, and I saw this, right? This is what people learn along the path. John C. Lilly was learning this too, that like in these psychedelic states, like how powerful our minds are to co-create an experience where we could really see something there that we didn't know. Like, we're not aware of how active our mind is at shaping our reality. And Wilson's a constant reminder of that. And so he finally settles on one night he's watching TV and a movie comes on, and it's about a comedy starring James Stewart, a black and white movie called Harvey, which is about this guy, James Stewart, who had contacts an imaginary friend who is a 6 foot tall white rabbit from the County Kerry called the Puka, right? And Wilson just happens to turn on the TV when at the scene when a character in the movie, also named Wilson, knocks down a book from a bookshelf, and it opens up to what the definition of a puka is, and it says like a vegetative spirit from the Celtic lore that is known to take people on crazy adventures. And how are you doing tonight, Mr. Wilson? Right. So Bob registers the same amount of shock while watching this on TV as the character reading it in the book. So we're going meta on meta here, you know. And this is all significant because, you know, so Wilson then settles on like, okay, well, my holy guardian angel per se is a 6 foot tall white rabbit from the county Kerry, is the puka. My holy guardian angel is the puka. And now, like, at a certain, that sounds like all funny and like jokey, and like for him, he did that, as he said, as a way to not take it as seriously, like not to get wrapped up in who exactly or what exactly this identity is, like, because maybe perhaps that's a pitfall on the path, if you will. Like you need to find out what exactly this is, who exactly that is, right? And Wilson is this constant meditation of like being at home in the unknown, to borrow a phrase from the late Anturo Ali, you know, to be okay, you know, and, you know, I used to listen a lot as well to those Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything tapes, you know, especially at times when I was stressed out and anxietous, because Wilson, I believe, embodied his truth, which was like relaxed concentration.
Mm-hmm.
If relaxed, it's very important, especially in these days, to work on relax, you know. Looks like we're going to hell in a handbasket and the shit house is up in flames, but just breathe and relax, because you can't get out of a crowded burning theater when you're panicking. You have to, you know, keep your concentration about you. And so I think that's in his voice, even in those interviews, or the Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything. And that's sort of like, he did the work and those were the results. Like he had his whole, he did all this stuff, right? And throughout the 70s, you know, settles on this notion of the puka and the holy guardian angel, you know, and he's kind of doing that for a certain ironic distance. Yet because he is, as Jesse Walker calls, like an epitome of the ironic style, right? Especially when it comes to interpreting conspiracy theories. Like before Wilson's crew and Bob, you know, the people, the way they thought about conspiracy theories, which is how when most people believe in them, they believe them full stop. And they're crazy, paranoid, annoying people to talk to, you know. But Wilson goes into the nut house and is able to just kind of keep an ironic grin while talking to all these people, because he sees that everyone has truth, everyone has a piece of the puzzle, and we have to remain open to receive that message from everyone we encounter. And that is a lot easier said than done, you know, especially you know. And so Wilson eventually sort of kind of moves along, because he's a mind that has to do that. So he moves along from that period of his life through viewing this sort of holy guardian angel as you know, some sort of telepathic communication. He delves into neurology more and more, and he sort of believes this theory that this woman Barbara Honegger, who was a writer, and she actually wrote about this thing called the October Surprise, like a political thing, which was how Reagan's crew sort of conspired to get Jimmy Carter unelected in the 1980 elections, you know, by withholding hostages in Iran, all this sort of stuff. But Barbara Honegger, she was also in the Navy too, which was interesting. But she, I think she's still around. She somehow told Bob about a theory, and I don't know if it was the Julian James bicameral mind theory, but sort of got him then believing like, well, it was just my right brain communicating with my left brain, et cetera, et cetera. But he's still continuing along. He's already in the magical path. He can't be taken out. So he's just, it's back to that conversation of Crowley's conversation of where does Awas emerge? Is it outside? Is it your deepest personality? Where, you know, and that'll, I guess, continue to be a conversation until the end of time. But, you know, he just eventually settles on, he gained a wonderful knowledge of self. He was able to communicate that, his interior life, in such a way that like other people could learn from it, and, you know, created some very effective maps that people could use to enrich and enlighten their lives. And that's the reason, one of the reasons why I wrote the book.
There you go. That's great. So where can people get the book?
Currently, I've self-published it. So it is really only available on Amazon and Lulu Press. I mean, if Amazon is the easiest, but Lulu Press is also really easy. I would say the one thing though, when typing in the name, like The Life and Thought Crimes of Robert Anton Wilson, please search with an ampersand, because there's some confusion about the word "and," right? It sounds tiny, but believe me, it's a big deal. Because
it's the same with Alan's books, Alan Greenfield's books. If you don't type the exact correct title in, sometimes you just don't see his books on Amazon. It's ridiculous. It's really annoying.
Yeah. So so it's on Amazon and also Lulu Press. And I like Lulu Press because it's a B corporation, so they're a little more, aware of their workers and whatnot. Well, I'd say a lot more aware of their workers than Amazon. And you could access that by going to my website, chapelperilous.us. And also my Substack page. I recommend people to subscribe, which is Gabriel Patrick Kennedy Substack. But yeah, so Amazon.com or my website, chapelperilous.us.
Now the book's out. Are you having a rest from Bob Wilson? Have you got any other projects?
That's a great question, Ken. Yeah, that's a very good question. I have a lot of ideas, sort of seeds for projects. I think that I have to clear out some, I don't know if that's the right, I made a lot of cuts to the book just to have it read as concisely as possible. But there are like a lot of tangents that I went on that I think are worthy to be read. And I think I want to kind of explore, I might put out a couple more things that are kind of that orbit around this book right now, like a kind of like a behind the scenes / compendium of a lot of the interviews that I did. So for instance, like interviews with Saul Paul Sarag, who is a particle physicist and a friend of Wilson's. He gave me he was very generous with his time, and he mentored me in like particle physics. So much of that I didn't put in the book, but I think that's super interesting. So I might, put like a little collection of the interviews and some behind the scenes in a book and put that out. And in terms of like another project, I wouldn't even mention it if I was working on it right now. I want it to be a surprise.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for everyone for turning up and commenting and sticking around. And we'll see you guys next week. I've got I can't remember who's coming on next week, but I'll announce it somewhere. And I'll announce it in the usual places, not just somewhere. I'll just put it somewhere randomly. No, I'll announce it in the usual places, and you guys should know what's coming up next. But thanks again.